Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are looking at what is honestly a massive geographical and political transformation. For decades, a huge, incredibly resource-rich stretch of central and eastern India was just bleeding. It was caught in the grip of left-wing extremism, and it came to be known as the Red Corridor. But over the last several years, something really incredible shifted. Through a highly complex mix of security operations combined with some super aggressive grassroots development, that deeply entrenched Red Corridor is rapidly transforming into what a lot of people are now calling a green corridor of development. So, let's dive into this. The main question we're exploring today is, how exactly did India pull this off? How was a deeply rooted, decades-long violent conflict systematically dismantled? Because it ultimately led to an official government declaration of a Naxal-free India by their target date of March 31, 2026. Now, this was definitely not an overnight victory. It took immense political will, a total top-to-bottom overhaul of their security strategy, and a completely new approach to community development.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, the rise of the Red Corridor. Second, years of peak violence. Third, the dual strategy approach. Fourth, surrenders and security gains. And finally, rebuilding and transforming Bastar.
Let's start with Part 1, the rise of the Red Corridor.
To really grasp why the solution to all this is such a big deal, we first kind of need to understand how left-wing extremism took hold in the first place. It really exploited the deep forests and tribal lands of India. What started back in 1967 as a pretty localized rebellion in Naxal quickly grew. By 1969, the Communist Party of India Marxist-Leninists was founded by Charo Majumdar, and their explicit goal was to capture power through armed struggle. Fast forward to the 1980s, and these groups were aggressively expanding into tribal strongholds. By the 1990s, they weren't just a militant group anymore. They were literally running parallel Jantana governments across vast forest regions. We're talking their own tax collection networks and their own armed forces, the whole shebang.
Moving right along to Part 2, years of peak violence.
By the late 2000s, this localized rebellion had completely metastasized. It was a highly organized, direct challenge to the Indian state. In fact, by 2009, the government officially labeled this the single biggest internal security challenge facing the nation. And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering scale of the crisis around the early 2010s. It was just devastating. Just look at 2010 alone. An attack on the Silda camp left 24 personnel dead, a massive ambush in Dantewada killed 76 security personnel, and a horrific train derailment claimed roughly 150 civilian lives. The extremists operated with almost absolute impunity. They destroyed schools and hospitals to physically block state access. They abducted a district collector in 2012. And in the 2013 Jaram Ghati attack, they literally surrounded and assassinated senior state politicians.
All right, Part 3, the dual strategy approach. Up until this point, the state's response just wasn't stemming the tide. The government finally realized that treating this purely as a policing issue, it was a losing battle. For years, the approach was basically just reactive policing, trying to respond to heavily armed attacks from these poorly equipped, really vulnerable outposts. But around 2015, the National Policy and Action Plan shifted the paradigm completely. It was a real game changer. They acknowledged that you absolutely cannot defeat Maoist ideology with just force alone. You have to outcompete them in local governance. This meant launching intelligence-led security operations directly alongside massive, immediate grassroots development to protect and uplift the local tribal populations. To actually pull this dual strategy off, the financial and infrastructural investment had to be historic. Under the security-related expenditure scheme, over 681 crore rupees were pumped into training and operations, and special central assistance for the most affected areas, that saw investments exceeding 3,000 crore rupees. But honestly, the most revealing metric here is the infrastructure. To put it into perspective, back in 2014, there were only 66 fortified police stations in these volatile areas. The state aggressively ramped that up to 656. They were physically securing the front lines so that all that development money could safely follow right behind it.
Which brings us to Part 4, surrenders and security gains. With this massive new infrastructure in place, operations intensified. The state took the fight directly into the core areas where the Naxalites actually planned their strategies, aiming to dismantle their leadership entirely. And you can see the results during the final aggressive push between January 2024 and March 2026. 706 extremists were killed in encounters, and over 2,200 were arrested. But wow, look at that last number, nearly 4,840 surrenders. That bar completely dwarfs the others, and that is the absolute hallmark of a movement collapsing from the inside out. By offering really robust rehabilitation policies in states like Maharashtra, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh, the government essentially hollowed out the movement, leading to the total elimination of the 21 Central Committee and Politburo members.
And to really ground these massive statistics, we have to look at the human story here. Take Rupesh Soni, for example. He was a Central Committee member, meaning he was high up in the leadership, and he surrendered along with over 200 other cadres. When your top-level leadership publicly states they've made the right decision to join the mainstream and literally begs others to follow, it signals a massive ideological breaking point. The backbone of the armed resistance was decisively broken.
Finally, Part 5, Rebuilding and Transforming Bastar.
Okay, so security operations only create a vacuum, right? You have to fill that vacuum with progress, or the extremism will just creep right back in. And progress, that starts with connectivity. 15,000. That is the number of kilometers of roads built under new connectivity projects in these Naxal-affected regions. For decades, the sheer lack of roads kept these areas totally isolated, which is exactly what allowed those parallel governments to thrive in the dark. By laying down over 15,000 kilometers of asphalt, the government didn't just build roads, they literally paved the way for the Green Corridor, connecting these isolated tribal communities to the rest of India for the very first time.
But what they did next with the security camps is honestly just brilliant. It worked in steps. First, you establish secure police camps deep inside the former rebel strongholds. Standard stuff. But then, phase 2. They took roughly a third of these outposts, over 70 camps, and converted them into what they called sevaderas, or service camps. So instead of just housing armed guards, these camps became integrated development hubs. Suddenly, they're delivering direct banking services, issuing Aadhaar identity cards, providing basic healthcare, and running skill training right at the tribal doorstep.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer variety of community rebuilding going on. This is what made the change permanent. Under the Niad-Nelanar scheme, they aggressively pushed 43 different beneficiary programs into these newly cleared areas. They even launched the Bastar Olympics. I mean, using sports to engage youth in an area that was once known purely for violence? Amazing. They built the Dantewada Education City to offer state-of-the-art schooling to kids from affected families. And remember all those thousands of surrendered cadres we talked about? They were placed into skill centers. They started learning trades, like electrical work, so they can actively rebuild the very communities they used to hide in. The impact of this is incredibly profound on an individual level. Just listen to Menu Ram Warda. He's a resident of Alabeda village, deep in the forests of Abjumad. He pointed out that he is actually the first person from his entire area to complete a Master of Arts degree. And the reason why? Because in the past, the Naxals simply wouldn't allow them to leave for education. When that heavy shadow of fear evaporates, human potential is finally unlocked.
All of this highly methodical, years-long work culminated on one specific target date, March 31st, 2026. This was when the government officially declared the nation free from the Naxal threat. Of course, this victory was deeply tied to the sacrifices of the security forces, which are now memorialized at Amarvatika. It stands as a stark reminder of the heavy price paid to replace bullets with ballot boxes and fear with development.
So what does this all mean for us? The crucial takeaway here is that defeating a deeply entrenched insurgency is never, ever just a military operation. It requires an absolute, unyielding commitment to bringing isolated people back into the fold. As Bastar and other regions continue to rebuild, creating this brand new identity defined by peace rather than conflict, it leaves us with a really compelling thought. In an era full of incredibly complex internal conflicts globally, what lessons can the rest of the world learn from the fall of India's Red Corridor? Could this exact blueprint, integrating hard security with hyper-local aggressive development, be the key to solving other deeply rooted conflicts? It is definitely a fascinating question to ponder. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.